Now then, if you only ever spent time on social media, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the human race is entirely composed of utter scumbags, that they enjoy nothing more than bickering, throwing insults at total strangers, and generally raging and overreacting to the most inconsequential matters. But it's not really that people are angrier these days, it's just that social media has made anger more visible. As Ricky Gervais has pointed out, before the digital age, we couldn't read every toilet wall in the world, and now we can. But one thing I never saw coming is the rise of amateur telepathy. I know that everyone has strong opinions, especially on subjects they know nothing about. But what I didn't realise is that so many people think they can read other people's minds. I am forever bombarded on social media by people who think I'm a privately educated, Tory-loving homophobe. Well, I went to a comprehensive, I've never voted Tory, and if I'm a homophobe, someone better let my boyfriend know about it. When I used to run courses on critical thinking, I would always start by explaining to my students that once they'd resorted to throwing insults or guessing the motives of their opponents, they'd lost the argument. When I make the case for free speech, for instance, the most common criticism I get is that I secretly support homophobic, racist and sexist ideas, and I just want to make it easier for bigots to express their views. But I know myself pretty well. I know that I oppose all forms of discrimination, and yet these total strangers online seem to think they know my private thoughts better than I do. And worse still, they declare their intuitions with the uttermost certainty. Imagine being that arrogant. Even Mystic Meg had a little bit of self-doubt. And it's not just the trolls on Twitter. This habit of mind reading is now commonplace in the mainstream commentariat and among politicians. Let's have a look at a few examples. Look at what Vince Cable had to say about those who voted to leave the European Union during his keynote speech at the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference in 2018.
75% of under 25s voted to remain. But 70% of over 65s voted for Brexit. Too many were driven by nostalgia for a world where passports were blue, faces were white, and the map was coloured imperial pink. And it was their votes on one wet day in June which crushed the hopes and aspirations of young people for years to come.
Now, there is a lot to admire in Vince Cable, but this idea that people were driven by nostalgia, that they longed for a time when passports were blue, faces were white, and the map was coloured imperial pink, appears to have been concocted from thin air. There is simply no evidence for it. Where are these people who voted leave out of a nostalgia for empire? It's just not a thing. One or two nutcases online squalling about the glories of Britain's past are no reflection of the country as a whole. But actually, I understand why so many people bought into this myth. It's because it explains something that many found inexplicable. Now, I've spoken to many people who simply could not understand why the majority of voters wanted to turn their backs on the EU. And now, here there is a simple solution. They wanted their empire back, even though all those who have ever had one are long dead. And this explanation tidies up a confusing business in a neat little formula. It's not the truth, but it'll do. Now, we saw similar efforts at mind reading after the election of Donald Trump. For instance, cultural commentator Laurie Penny decided that Trump won because of white resentment, born of a frustration that, quote, women, migrants and people of colour no longer seem to know their proper place. When Trump voters express concern for ordinary people, Penny tells us, they mean white people. Now, Penny is certainly correct that there are some unpleasant individuals out there who are motivated by racial prejudice. But this kind of blanket assessment of such a broad contingent of the electorate is hardly a productive approach. And, more importantly, this kind of guesswork is never going to be accurate. After the Conservative victory in the 2019 United Kingdom general election, we had lots of people claiming to be able to read the minds of the general public. The actor John Hannah, for instance, said, "Turns out we're a country of racists." The journalist Paul Mason called this a victory of the old over the young, racists over people of colour. Singer Lily Allen said the Conservative triumph was evidence of this country's deep-rooted racism and misogyny. Again, I understand why people might rely on these kinds of mischaracterisations. They provide balm for the wounds of defeat, and they offer convenient and comprehensible explanations. But consider this. If when someone disagrees with you, Your immediate reaction is to assume they must be lying for nefarious purposes. What does that say about you? It suggests that you consider your own opinion to be the default. Why else would you just jump to these extreme conclusions? Why can't you accept that people aren't lying when they disagree with you? They just disagree. It seems a lot like a form of narcissism to assume that those who challenge us cannot be being honest. When we interpret our detractors' opinions in the most ungenerous way, we are indulging in a common ad hominem circumstantial argument called the appeal to motive. You'll have noticed the tendency, particularly common on the left, to assume that political opponents are not merely wrong, but evil. And this can never be the starting point for any reasonable debate. And we all share this tendency to make false assumptions about our opponents. I often quote a line from Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay's book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, because I think this is a great rule of thumb. They say, if you must make an assumption about your partner's intentions, make only one. Their intentions are better than you think. If we're serious about breaking out of our echo chambers and moving beyond the political tribalism that has so degraded public discourse, we should always keep in mind what Philip Roth writes in his novel The Human Stain. Our understanding of people must always be, at best, slightly wrong.